Hey fellas, 2021 was a pretty crazy year for all of us, and it was a year where we watched a hell of a lot of strange films, so sit back, relax, and just enjoy the good memories along with the bad. So kicking off the new year, as they always say, your first film of the year should be an important one because that can spell out exactly how the year's going to go. And remembering that last year, the first film I watched was Solace, which is a film all about somebody trapped alone on a spaceship, hurtling towards certain doom. Yeah, that actually was kind of indicative of what was going on last year. But anyway, this year, the film I kicked off was actually one of my Friday night film night ones, called Triangle. And that's an offbeat horror movie set on a haunted ghost ship. Now, you're probably already thinking, hang on a minute, there's only one good haunted ship movie, and that's Ghost Ship. And even that gets absolutely rubbish about 15 minutes in after the amazing opening sequence. But Triangle turns out to be a really interesting film nonetheless, and it's all about how this group of pals who head out on a day's boating get shipwrecked and they end up being saved by a giant empty cruise liner. Only pretty soon, it turns out that the main lassie realises something's very wrong on the ship. And I don't want to spoil the mystery because it's one of those ones that unfolds as it goes along, and there are a few interesting turns in it. And it's quite a clever little twist-filled story that feels kind of like an extended episode of The Twilight Zone or something like that. The film's the brainchild of film director and writer Christopher Smith, who's made a few other unsettling movies, for example Creep, and I mean the old film Creep, not the one that just came out a couple of years ago. This is the one that's all about the London Underground and some weird and nasty guy who's hiding out there and murdering people. And he also made the film Severance, which is a black comedy about a bunch of office workers getting mixed up with the Russian mafia while on like a paintballing weekend. And that's kind of a nuts movie. And apparently he made Black Death, but I've not seen that yet. All I know is Sean Bean's in it, so he probably dies because it's Sean Bean. And yeah, I'd give Triangle 4 out of 5. I mean, that's definitely after having thought about it for a bit, because it's a bit of a grower. When I first finished watching it, I was like, okay, that was okay. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the things that happened on the movie, the more I thought, actually, yeah, that's a pretty good film. There was pretty clever stuff that happened in that. So yeah, that's my starter for the year. And on the basis of that, who knows? 2021 might actually be a pretty good one. And in a similar vein, or at least you would think so, was a Polish movie called Werewolf, or Wilkolak, possibly. I'm not sure, I don't speak any Polish, so I can't really comment on that. But even so, the title is actually a little bit misleading. And this is a period film set at the end of World War II, where a group of Polish kids get liberated from Gross-Rosen concentration camp in Poland, and they end up getting put up in the house of this woman, who's probably a collaborator. At least I assumed that from her funny haircut. And it turns out that along with like the lack of available food and water and the ever-present threat of nasty rapey Russians and murderous Nazis hiding in the woods, there's also something really creepy stalking the forest killing people. And I'm not going to give things away because it is quite an interesting movie, other than to say it's more of a psychological thriller than it is a monster movie. And it's actually really well made, with some really understated performances from the kids, who obviously are playing Jewish kids who've supposedly been in the Holocaust. So they've got huge amounts of trauma, and they actually play it up in really interesting ways. And again, solid 4 out of 5 for this film as I'm concerned. And really the only issue with the film is that it's kind of disjointed, and some of the scenes feel a little weird because they've clearly been edited out of order after the fact. So that does muddle the timeline of the story a little bit, and the end of the film lacks a little bit the punch that it might have had. But overall, this was a really interesting film, kind of in the vein of something like Pan's Labyrinth or Tigers Are Not Afraid. And I would definitely recommend it, especially if you like World War films, or, yeah, just interesting foreign movies. So over the last year that I've been doing these movie reviews, I've had a fairly bad track record when it comes to serial killer movies and police procedurals. There have been a couple of good ones, but mostly it's been stuff like the horrors of Welcome to the Punch and Night Hunter. Ugh. And this year, it hasn't improved, because this year I watched Bad Samaritan, which is kind of a police procedural serial killer movie, but not quite. But it's very much in keeping with those two that I mentioned. And it's all about the guy who was on Misfits, that quirky British TV show about young superhero mutants, that was a bit like Heroes if Heroes was really, really boring and everybody on it was a young offender. In Bad Samaritan, he's a photographer, and he's got a nice life, he's got a loving mum and stepdad, he's got a beautiful girlfriend. But because he's a bit of an arse, he also has a wee sideline in robbing houses, where him and his mate, they nip round to folks' homes and start, stealing all their stuff when they're supposedly parking their cars while they're in a restaurant. Of course, this all goes horribly wrong, where he accidentally robs David Tennant, who's a mega rich trust fund guy, and when he's in there he finds a kidnapped woman locked in the office. Of course, this all ends up going bad because he can't actually get her free, and Doctor Who realises that he's been there when he gets back and sets out to use all of his massive wealth to completely wreck this guy's life and that of just about everybody else around him. And it's not unwatchably bad, it's just really, really silly and full of so many holes that it's really hard to take any of the film seriously because so many stupid things are happening. Now, it was better than the other two, much better than Welcome to the Punch, much better than Night Hunter, because it had a few moments of being decent amidst all the completely ridiculous computer nonsense. Police doing things that police don't do, lawyers doing things that they wouldn't do, the guy trying to hand himself into the FBI and the police and just being turned around and sent home with a don't waste our time, just so the plot can continue, lest any kind of common sense get in the way of this rip-roaring yarn, which wasn't all that rip or that roaring. So yeah, 2 out of 5 for this, with the caveat that it's better than other films that I've mentioned, but not by much. And the last movie I saw in January was this absolutely bonkers piece of total madness. Now, I've seen some cheap and cheerful movies on this channel before, like I talked about Bad Taste, which was from New Zealand, and Bocas from South America. Well, this one's from Uganda, and it's called Who Killed Captain Alex? And this film literally was made for $200. I mean, that's what they said, you know, and it kind of looks like it. I mean, it's nuts. But clearly everybody involved was just a bunch of amateurs having a great time. And the only version of this in existence is one with this kind of weird karaoke-style commentary track over the top, because apparently, like, the filmmaker deleted the original version of his computer to make his next movie, and this was the only one that they actually had a copy of. So yeah, it's now considered a bit of a cult classic. And the story is all about this Ugandan army leader called Captain Alex, who's kind of like a good James Bond guy, and he spends all his time fighting the Tiger Mafia, who want to kill him. And honestly, very little of the plot makes any sense whatsoever. And there's loads of death, loads of shooting, some kung fu, and people seeking revenge. And I can't honestly say this is a good film. It's certainly a lot of fun to watch, especially if you know what you're getting into. If you just want to watch something absolutely cheesy and ridiculous, it's 4 out of 5. I mean, it is one of the daftest fun times you'll ever have. You know, have a few beers and watch it with some pals. If you like terrible movies, you'll have a brilliant time. If not, just avoid it like the plague. So first up this month was an Amazon Prime film I saw called Strigoi. Now, in case you're not overly familiar with Eastern European mythology, a Strigoi is basically another word for a supernatural thing. I mean, there's lots of different types of them, but think of the film V that I saw last year. Actually, don't think about it because it was terrible. But yeah, anyway, this film, Strigoi, rather than being a creepy horror film or a terrible action movie, this is more like a black comedy. And it feels kind of like something like sort of a low-rent film in the vein of Shaun of the Dead, or a bit more like Bad Day for the Cut, or even sillier than that. And it's all about a guy called Vlad. He's like a young guy who's just come back from working in Paris, where he went to become a doctor. But he ended up just working in a fast food restaurant and became disenchanted with everything and came back home again. Only when he gets back, he finds out the locals are acting kind of weird and holding a vigil over a dead guy who appears to have been strangled to death. And weirder still, Vlad's name is actually the signatory on the death certificate. So it's up to him to kind of figure out what on earth's going on and get to the bottom of all this craziness. And it's actually pretty good fun. I mean, the laughs are genuine, the comic timing's great, and the film's almost entirely in English, which helps a huge amount. But I'm only giving it about 3 out of 5, because despite it being fairly solid and quite funny, it meanders about all over the place, and it could have been an awful lot tighter with a bit more of a cohesive ending. Not that you'll have a bad time with it, but you might find yourself just going, "What?" quite a few times, but with a few plot points towards the end of the film, and maybe checking your watch a couple of times round about the 2/3 mark. But still, definitely well worth checking out. Now, as I've said often, sometimes I watch really good stuff, and sometimes I watch absolute garbage. And CarousHell, which is my next movie, get it? It's like a carousel, but from hell. Yeah, it falls definitely into the garbage category. Now, this is a low-budget film from Amazon Prime that was clearly shot for about $100 in his mum and dad's house by a guy with a few of his pals. And it feels like something that's a bit of a rip-off trauma movie, and it's all about a carousel horse. Now, stick with me because this gets crazy. He's a carousel horse that has the soul of a Nazi murderer that's being watched over by like a magical cowboy guy. And one day the horse gets really angry and breaks free when an annoying kid wipes his bogies over it and sneezes on it and stuff. So then this horse or unicorn or whatever goes on this murderous rampage across town trying to kill this kid, who happens to be at a house party that his sex-mad sister's gone to. And the rest of the movie is the unicorn trying to get inside, and all manner of murders happening, and in between terrible, terrible scenes of the party and really unfunny stuff that gets beaten into the ground with terrible running jokes, like one about a pair of incestuous French Canadians, and how like the kid's sister wants to desperately sleep with the pizza guy who can't leave until he gets paid for the pizza. He also happens to be played by the director, and it's awful, like 2 out of 5 awful. I mean, The only good thing about this is actually the special effects, like the practical gore effects, are really, really well done. And despite the film's jokes falling flat, there is a couple of decent bits that will have you giggling, so 2 stars at least for that. But those moments are so few and far between. And the film is literally just over an hour long, and yet it somehow feels much longer. So, no, this is not a recommendation, unless this is absolutely the kind of thing that you love, and you can put up with films that are pretty terrible. And this is a curious wee nugget that popped up on Amazon Prime. Prisoner X tells the story of Carmen. She's like a CIA agent brought in because her ex-boyfriend or partner, which wasn't really clear, killed himself while interrogating a terrorist who appeared in the airport, and apparently is from the future. So Carmen has to pick up where he left off, because how can you stop a terrorist organisation when they literally know everything that's going to happen and can zap back through time to counter whatever it is you're trying to do? So it's up to her to break through and figure out his plans and find a way to save the world, all from this wee underground secret facility. Now, it's fairly clear watching the film that this is a low-budget movie, and I have to be honest, it actually does pretty well with the very few locations that it has, as well as the slightly bonkers premise. And this film's a solid 3 out of 5. I mean, it's pretty average. Most of the mystery and intrigue revolves around who has the upper hand in the series of interrogation scenes, and they're pretty good, and Carmen does her best to try and uncover what it is that led her ex-partner to top himself. But the real standout here is Romano Orzari, who looks disturbingly like a young Armando Sante a lot of times during the film, but he actually holds his own as this sinister future terrorist. But yeah, anyway, this film's cheap and cheerful, and occasionally the writing doesn't really make the best use of its premise, but yeah, I had a good time with it. Kind of enjoyed what I saw, and fun, mediocre B-movie. And my last film for February was one that was absolutely terrible, and that was I Care a Lot. Now, this is the kind of film that really should have been great. I mean, it has an amazing cast, it has a really interesting premise, it's brilliantly shot, and it's totally the kind of thing that I normally go for. I mean, it's clever, it's funny, and it's kind of darkly comic and a bit witty. The trouble is, none of it worked. Essentially, this film is about Rosamund Pike, who plays this businesswoman who specialises in having isolated older people sent to care homes against their will, and after which she sells their homes and all their stuff and pockets all the money, while claiming she's using it all to pay for her care home fees. All of which, it turns out, is actually 100% legal in America, which is the kind of scary part about the movie and what the film's trying to point a finger at and say, this is a terrible, terrible thing. Only it turns out that one of the people that she kidnaps into the home isn't actually a lonely old rich woman at all. She's actually the mum of a Russian mobster hiding under an assumed name. So of course Peter Dinklage, who it turns out is, the Russian mobster who's her son, sets out to get her back while Rosamund Pike tries to keep her in there and tries to figure out a way to extort millions from Peter Dinklage. And all of this sounds like it should work in a really blackly comic way and could be quite interesting, yeah? Only it's not. It's just not funny. The film is not funny, even despite trying. And the film also seems to labour under this weird mistaken idea that the audience is going to be rooting for Rosamund Pike's character. But the whole first 10-15 minutes of the film basically shows her to be utterly irredeemable and horrible. And you spend the whole movie wanting Peter Dinklage to do something terrible to her, because he actually comes off as a more sympathetic character. And there's a scene in the middle of the movie where they both come face to face when she gets captured by the mobsters. And you're hoping she's going to die horribly, or hell, I was hoping that she was actually going to be force-fed her equally horrible girlfriend who'd already been kidnapped by the bad guys. But no, everything's fine, and it goes all very silly in a really daft way, and after that it turns almost into a zany comedy where she's borderline some kind of like genius heist type person. I mean, the whole film is complete rubbish, and it's a real shame because it hasn't got the guts to go down the route of something dark like a McDonagh movie like in Bruges or something, or again like Bad Day for the Cat, which I mentioned earlier in this episode. But yeah, anyway, 2 out of 5. Don't even bother with this. It's I only give it 2 out of 5 rather than 1 because genuinely all the actors seem to be doing good work. I mean, there's not a bad performance in this, but the script is still absolutely terrible. So don't waste the 2 hours of your life on this film. Give it a skip. Now, interestingly, having just mentioned Elysium, that was the Neil Blomkamp film that had Matt Damon in it, it's kind of fitting that my next movie was actually a film that was an anthology of short films made by that director, and Oats Studios, which is his own personal studio production company. So this film is cleverly titled Oats Studios Volume 1. Now, it's an interesting wee idea with a whole bunch of sci-fi shorts, which all do fun things and presumably are all dry runs at ideas that could be expanded into full feature movies. And some of them are pretty good, like the aliens that get in your brains, and there's another story that's about a Vietnam ghost monster kind of guy who's on fire. What doesn't really work are some of the weird CGI animated stories about a weapon test lab, and a running gag about a cooking channel show which just goes wrong in kind of weird, bizarre and horrible ways, and the guy ends up having to eat hair and things, and but most of them are kind of dull and repetitive, I mean, especially the cooking channel stuff. And the best part of the whole film was a short towards the end about Dakota Fanning, who's an android in a biotest facility with an experiment that's gone wrong, and she's being chased around by a giant ball of hands, and our human commander, who's kind of badly hurt. And that was genuinely tense and a lot of fun, but honestly, I'd kind of skip this movie. I mean, it's 2 out of 5 at best, and most of the stories aren't that good, despite having decent cast and decent actors and being fairly well shot. And it's a shame, because Blomkamp made one of the genuinely great movies out there. I mean, he made District 9, which is just fantastic, and everything since then, it's kind of been a series of diminishing returns, and this is just another blip on that downward trajectory. I mean, if you want to watch a bunch of sci-fi shorts, maybe check out Love, Death, Robots. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that all of them are good. It's a bit up and down, but you've probably got a slightly better chance of finding something fun in that than you will here. But going from one film that had pretty naff animation to one with really good animation, I also watched Fantastic Mr. Fox, which is the adaptation of the Roald Dahl book from the 1980s. Roald Dahl, who also wrote stuff like Matilda, The Witches, James and the Giant Peach, and You Only Live Twice. A lot of these things have been variously adapted over the years, and Fantastic Mr. Fox is a Wes Anderson film. I mean, you might remember me mentioning him directing The Grand Budapest Hotel, which is a brilliant film, and so is this. And it's basically the plot of Dahl's book, which is about a hungry dad fox who wants to look after his family and his friends by sneaking into the farms of a trio of mad farmers and stealing lots of food and cider. But this is all played with a very Wes Anderson-y, difficult family dynamic side of things that isn't in the book at all, with George Clooney as Mr. Fox being very bad at being a good dad but trying hard all the way. And it's definitely one that's good for all the family. I mean, kids are going to really enjoy the silly stuff, while adults are going to get the clever jokes and the story beats that go right over the kids' heads. So yeah, I mean, 4 out of 5, you're going to have a good time with this. I'd be very surprised if you didn't. And it also just has a fantastic cast, and generally, there's very little not to recommend about this movie. And here's something just a little bit different. Although I do dip into foreign films quite a lot, I don't think I've ever actually covered an Indian movie. Certainly not a Bollywood film, although I'm not sure this is technically Bollywood, although it is in a Hindi language. It wasn't made in Bombay, which I think is what makes the distinction. Anyway, it's called Tumbbad, and it's a film all about a guy called Vinayak. And he learns as a wee boy about a weird temple where his grand, like an immortal monster, has to be kept chained up and made to sleep by saying the name of the god Hastar. Anyway, a whole bunch of stuff happens and he ends up chatting to Gran, who's turned into a tree, and tells him how to get unlimited gold from the pit below the temple in exchange for burning her, which is the only way to end her immortal torment. And the film follows Vinayak over the years as he grows up, gets married, and very slowly but surely gives in to more and more greedy temptation, and as he gets older even ropes his own son into the family business of stealing gold from a creepy monster's bell. And this is a really good, bizarre wee horror film, even if the message of colonialism has ruined India and money is the root of all evil is really, really on the nose throughout the entire thing. But in terms of a compelling story, it's just really interestingly shot, really interestingly made, and the locations are fantastic, and for a film that cost apparently under £1 million to make, which let's face it is pretty much nothing these days, it genuinely is quite impressive. Anyway, I'd give it a solid 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. It's on Amazon Prime, and remember to turn the subtitles on, because if you don't, they don't show up, and you know, I don't know about you, but I don't speak very much other than English and bad English. But yeah, Tumbbad. Check it out. Next up is a horror film called Vigil. Now, there aren't very many Jewish-themed horror movies, unless you count something like maybe The Keep from back in the 80s, or maybe The Possession, which was definitely a Jewish-themed one, because it was all about a Dybbuk box, which is like a Jewish demon prison thing in a wooden box. But anyway, The Vigil is about Yakov, who works as a shomer, which is like a semi-religious job where somebody has to watch over the corpse of a recently deceased person in the community the night before the funeral. Only as it turns out, Yakov ends up with the corpse when there's a demon in the house, and during the course of the night it causes him no end of scares and harm and worry and threatening his life. Now, this was kind of a fun film. I mean, it was decently made, it was very reminiscent of The Babadook in a lot of ways, and it was largely unclear for a lot of the film whether the demon was even real or if it was a figment or dream of this guy's clearly troubled mind, and maybe partly the spooky setting taking its toll on him. And yeah, it did have a few cheap jump scares, and overall, the script could have been a bit tighter, but generally, this wasn't a bad experience. I mean, it was a solid 3 out of 5, good scary evening in if you have a Netflix subscription and you fancy a bit of a spooky movie. And I suppose with everything else being pretty decent, or at least okay in April, I was due a duffer. And that's where Outlaws and Angels comes in. This western tells the story of a gang of outlaws who blast their way out of a bank and then go on the run to Mexico down a difficult route, till eventually they arrive starved and thirsty at the house of a bunch of weirdo farmers, headed up by John Crichton himself from Farscape, but with a weird hairdo and tash. Also his ultra-conservative Bible-bashing wife, and the two chalk-and-cheese daughters who were always arguing. Of course, the appearance of a load of ragged, nasty outlaws doesn't really make him too happy, and the leader takes a shine to his youngest daughter. She plays nice at first, right up until the point it turns out she actually hates her family and things start going down a very bloody and nasty turn. Meanwhile, Luke Wilson and Gomez from Breaking Bad are tracking them down looking for a showdown. Now, this is grindhouse cinema. I mean, you know grindhouse, that kind of cheap 70s looking cinema, full of violence and bad camera work and usually lurid subject matter. Well, I mean, this movie doesn't fail the audience in that regard, because, you know, there's bloody murder all over the place, sexual assault aplenty, a lot of implied and overtly stated incest, and it also doesn't help that the script is kind of rubbish, and the actors clearly aren't getting the direction they need, and not least of all, Clint Eastwood's real-life daughter, who plays Florence the Psycho. It also wouldn't actually be such a bad movie if it had ended at the pretty solid natural ending point, but instead the film drags on for another 20 minutes for no particularly good reason, even after the narrator has died on screen and done his final narration, which would suggest to me that either there was reshoots or somebody jumbled things about in the edit, or maybe just somebody was just an idiot. So yeah, 2 out of 5. I would skip it unless you really like grindhouse or you just love watching all westerns. So in the grand tradition of watching terrible low-budget indie films off Amazon, I watched a movie called The Alchemist's Cookbook. Now, this is one of those films in the vein of Who Killed Captain Alex or Bad Taste that was clearly shot by some guy who was a film student in his grand's caravan a long weekend during the school holidays. And The Alchemist Cookbook's all about Sean, who is a practicing alchemist, who's got this weird old book that he's working his way through, while every now and again his pal Cortez comes bringing him supplies and, more importantly, his medication for whatever's mentally wrong with him. And one day his pal forgets the pills, and after that things get a lot weirder and Sean's sanity starts slipping, or maybe he's actually managed to summon some sort of demon, it's not entirely clear. And if this sounds a little bit familiar, it's probably because it's not a million miles away from the movie Sator, which does a very similar guy alone in the woods going mad, or is it really a monster or demons? Only Sator was actually a well-acted, subtle and beautifully shot film. This is exactly what it looks like. It's some laddie with a camcorder who's just at film school, who has very good intentions but clearly doesn't have the skills or the budget to make his vision really come off. And really, there's absolutely nothing else to recommend this. I'd give this a 2 out of 5 just purely because there was a couple of moments where it made me chuckle, but the rest of the movie is absolutely terrible. And I think all those moments were basically down to Cortez. So yeah, watch Sator instead, or The Evil Dead, or Mary Poppins, or hell, anything, really. Next up after that, because Friday night film choices are apparently some kind of summer poison, was Night of the Wererooster. Yes, you heard that right. Wererooster. And this is a movie where 5 disparate souls head off into the woods to try and find out what happened to their missing loved ones, led by a girl called Charlotte, who's a slightly offbeat lassie who might just know something about what's happening. And one by one they start getting picked off by the mysterious Wererooster, which, just by the way, you never actually see, so don't watch this if you're hoping to see some kind of creature feature. And basically this is just a really bad parody of Predator made by people who don't realise that they're not very funny. So yeah, this is garbage. And it was shot on the super cheap, and everybody involved is an absolute rank amateur. But I mean, you know that. I've got to be honest, again, I did chuckle at a couple of dumb gags and silly lines, so at least the movie has that going for it, if nothing else. 2 out of 5, skip it unless you're very, very drunk, or just want to watch something absolutely terrible. It's been a while since I watched some decent sci-fi, and Moon 44 is not that, but it is a classic example of B-movie obscurity, made by Roland Emmerich, he of Independence Day, The Patriot, and Stargate, and starring a lot of people that you've never heard of. Like this one guy who Arnie killed off in The Terminator, and this other dude who's been in things and stuff, and Malcolm McDowell, who's picking up a check, is clearly the bad guy. And one thing that's interesting is that Dean Devlin is one of the main cast in this film. Now, you might know the name Dean Devlin, but you've probably not recognised him, because he's not really an actor. I don't think he actually did any acting after this, but on the set of this film, he got to be really good pals with Roland Emmerich, and he's been the writer on most of Emmerich's films ever since. And this film's all about in the future where corporations are mining moons for resources. So far, so topical. But unfortunately, space pirates also want these resources, so they start attacking the moon bases in drone ships. So to save money, the company decides to send convicts to work as defence pilots in exchange for reduced sentences. And they also send in Tough Guy McStoic, who's actually an internal affairs cop sent to figure out who's secretly sabotaging this operations. And you would actually be forgiven for thinking that this was some late 70s or early 80s film from the look and feel of it, in part because the aesthetic and the set design is shamelessly stolen from films like Alien, Blade Runner, Star Wars, and that this was a movie that was definitely made on the super cheap in West Germany when that was still a thing, just before the Berlin Wall came down, and it was actually released shortly afterwards in 1990. But it's kind of a mess. It's got some bad dialogue, hammy performances, and a story that doesn't know if it's Prisoner Cell Block H, Top Gun, Aliens, or something weird in the middle. But you know what? It is vaguely compelling and watchable, so yeah, 3 out of 5 for what was a surprisingly endearing piece of humdrum space nonsense. Check it out. Now, there's not many films out there that are so forgettable that you forget they even existed, even after having watched them. Unless maybe it's The Judge, a film so humdrum I completely forgot that I'd actually watched it, which is why I'm mentioning it now while I still remember. What was I talking about? Oh, anyway. Silent Trigger is an action movie with a group of mediocre actors trying to make a movie that doesn't want to be boring, but somehow manages to be completely forgettable nonetheless. It's all about Dolph Lundgren, and he's a big-time government sniper dude, but when he refuses to shoot a target because she's holding a baby, he gets the sack, and the sack means getting dead. Dead sacked. Only he doesn't actually get dead, and a few years or months or maybe even weeks later, he gets employed again, with the same spotter as before, who was already ordered to kill him last time. Strange. Anyway, they have to make the shot from a building that's still under construction, so they need to head up there the night before and get prepped, but it also turns out that the security guard there is a coked up sex maniac, and also there might be something quite sinister going on in the background. And it's basically a by-the-numbers action schlock movie anytime that the bonkers security redneck guy isn't on screen, although props for having her off-coupling in it, who does her best, and Dolph Lundgren generally just looks bored for most of the movie, and this is like 2 out of 5 at best, and chances are you'll have forgotten you've even seen it before you wonder why it was called Silent Trigger. Especially when all the gunshots in it were so very loud. And another example in the land of not really amazing was Runaway. And yeah, I don't mean the Kanye West experimental music video Runaway. I mean the Michael Crichton directed movie with Tashman himself, Tom Selleck, as a future cop in charge of an anti-robot unit in the police force. Yeah, I mean this is about as near future as people imagined in the 1980s, where everybody has a giant robot helper to do things, kind of like out that Rocky movie.
Watch this.
And as usual, Crichton has come up with a story about how man's hubris with technology is going to be his downfall. Anyway, Gene Simmons from Kiss is in it as a kind of creepy, slimy tech genius who's reprogramming the robots to do his evil bidding and take over the world or something, and Tom has to figure it out and stop him, but with robots everywhere, can he really trust anything? Anyway, I mean, it was okay. It was horribly dated, so I don't know, 2 out of 5 for this. I mean, it wasn't the worst film I've ever seen, but God knows, I don't think I'd ever want to watch it again. So you remember me talking about The Judge, yeah? No, me neither. Anyway, All the Money in the World is a pretty interesting film. So it's all about the true life story of John Paul Getty and how his grandson got kidnapped by ransomers, but then, being like the richest man in the world, refused to actually pay out the ransom because he was really tight-fisted. So instead, the kid's mum had to try and sort it all out with the help of the old geezer's head of security. Now, this is a Ridley Scott movie, so as you'd expect, it looks fantastic. There's good performances from Marky Mark and her off Dawson's Creek. It is worth mentioning, obviously, that this story has been told before. I mean, there was a BBC FX show called Trust, which basically recounts the same story that had Donald Sutherland playing the role of Getty. And for the most part, it's a really interesting film, really well told, if clearly they've kind of taken some facts and events and fudged it a little bit just to make reality work better in a sort of movie storytelling fashion. And it's a perfectly enjoyable film. It's a good thriller, it's an interesting drama. But yeah, if there's one thing that's worth mentioning, it's that Getty was played by the late awesome Christopher Plummer. But what's interesting about that is all of Plummer's scenes were shot in 12 days, like literally 12 days. And he's not just a minor character, he's in the film all the way through it. And all of that happened, of course, because just before the film was going to come out, all these nasty allegations about Kevin Spacey came out. Originally, he'd starred in the film in heavy prosthetics and old man makeup to try and make it appear that he was actually a 70-year-old man. And yeah, it kind of worked. It would have been certainly interesting, but anyway, you'd never know now because basically there's like only, I think, one wide shot of him actually left in the movie and everything else got replaced with all these 12 days of shooting. And just to say, Plummer absolutely knocks it out of the park. So, I mean, for that performance alone, and also, you know, the movie being pretty solid by itself, it's a 4 out of 5. It's a workhorse of a Ridley Scott movie. Definitely not his best work, but, you know, far better than a lot of his recent films from kind of around this period, some of which were decidedly not so great, shall we say.
Sure.
So wait, hold up. Here we are at the halfway point, and I'd like to make a little admission here. I did try my best, but I haven't managed to catch up with all the films that I missed. Some of you guys watched the other ones, but since they just aren't easily available anymore, I didn't watch them, or some of the other ones I just haven't had time. So here's just a little bit of a tip of the hat and a nod to these missed gems that you guys enjoyed that I didn't. Infinity Chamber. A Murray choice, which I can only guess is some kind of sci-fi thing about a big room that lasts a while, or possibly a time travel sort of 11/22/63 thing, or maybe something along the lines of Boss Level. I didn't see it. Sorry Maz, if it ever comes back for free on Amazon or Netflix, I promise I'll give this one a whirl. Escape from Pretoria. Look, I just haven't had time to see Homeless Harry Potter on holiday. I will get round to watching it at some point, because this is actually one of the few that is still available on Amazon Prime. I swear, I will watch it this year. I swear. The Monster Club. Ironically, this is actually on YouTube, so you never know, maybe I will see this someday, but it's got Vincent Price in it, it's some kind of horror thing. Y'all said it was boring, but that's never really stopped me before, so yeah, we'll see what happens. And as for Dreamer, fuck knows. Honestly, I'm actually glad I missed this. It looks naff as hell, but there you go. Some you win, some you lose. And I think I won in this case. So anyway, back to the movies that we did all see.
The Dark, on the other hand, is a low-budget horror movie. And this started out with like a creepy guy heading to a cabin in the woods and looked every bit this kind of low-budget slasher movie until, sure enough, he gets munched by a monster, but the monster that munches him was kind of like a zombie teenage vampire girl, who also then manages to find a blinded, kidnapped teenage boy in the boot of his car. And it turns out she's actually kind of lonely, and so is he, and in between getting to know each other and her killing random cops and woodsmen and rednecks and other random passers-by, they form a sort of bond together. And this was actually a pretty interesting wee film, especially for a film that was shot on a shoestring budget. And there's clear parallels with like Frankenstein's story here with the monster befriending a blind person, as well as like the obvious comparisons with like that famous Scandinavian film Let the Right One In, which, you know, the one about the bullied kid and his vampire best friend. And here instead these kids are a little bit older and they've both experienced a lot of severe and horrible abuse and trauma. So really though, what shone through was how unapologetically this film makes no bones about how the ghoulish girl is a monster. I mean, she genuinely just like kills lots of random people who you're like, I'm not sure they deserve to die. But the point was, she's still the protagonist of the story, and it switches that usual monster movie story from being the point of view of the victims to the point of view of this creature just trying to get on about her day, but then being confronted with people that are basically actually her food. And it never really vilifies them, and it never really vilifies her. And it's not a perfect film. I mean, it has some pacing issues, and it never quite manages to land the emotional blows that I think it was aiming to try and do, but really, I enjoyed it. I mean, I'm going to give it 4 out of 5 flesh-eating teeny boppers just for this being a quirky little film, and kind of being a lot of fun. And due to circumstances beyond my control, I also had to endure The Tomorrow War. And that's a big budget film that's being advertised almost relentlessly on Amazon Prime, and it's all about Chris Pratt, who has to shoot aliens in the future because of time travel or something. Basically, this is like the movie that some writer must have come up with during a fever dream after a heavy weekend of drinking nothing but meths and Benylin, and mainlining Aliens, The Thing, Battle Los Angeles, The Last Starfighter, and Edge of Tomorrow, all on different TVs but playing at the same time. And the plot is that one day, future people arrive during a football match, saying that there's a war coming, so they need to send people, and those people have to be ones that are due to die before the future war, because otherwise there might be a paradox. But then they'll send them to get the alien menace, but they only have to fight for a week. So Chris Pratt gets selected because he's due to die before the day of the war, and also because he's an ex-soldier, and he ends up leading a crew of complete no-hopers through on a mission to find an alien-killing virus, led by his own daughter in the future, who's now a general. Look, this is not a good film. It's watchable. I mean, the plot makes very little sense. The characters are terribly written, and the aliens are actually pretty boring. I mean, they're kind of mid-tier in the ranks of weird alien monsters and films. And I mean, you know, and it's not the biggest pool in the world, but I mean, you know. And I'm not even going to get into the ins and outs of how full of the holes the script is, because that would need its own video, and frankly, there's already plenty of those on the internet already. Suffice to say, this is at best 2 out of 5, because while there are some nice action scenes and it's competently filmed, the acting isn't terrible. It's just that for like a $200 million Hollywood epic, this plays out like the cutscenes from like a low-tier third-person video game shooter from like 2012 or something like that. Utterly, utterly forgettable. Just like that other movie that had, I think it had Iron Man in it. I just can't seem to remember what the hell it was all about. What was that film about? Now, one thing you can bet is that if somebody makes a movie and it's successful, then somebody else with less talent and less money will try and capitalise on the idea by copying it badly. And George and the Dragon is exactly that film. What's it about? Well, It's about George, who's a knight, who's been off crusading, and then he comes back with his friend the Saracen, and they want to do a wee quest to get some land and give up knighting, and he wants to go and be a farmer. So he ends up agreeing to help Patrick Swayze rescue a princess from a dragon that might have kidnapped her, and I think he doesn't think the dragon exists, and it's not entirely clear, and it's a bit strange because his dad definitely had his legs chopped off by something, probably a dragon, and it's very vague and boring, and frankly, I stopped paying that much attention because the plot's really badly told, and this film is awful. Now, it's no surprise that this came out about 3 years after the film A Knight's Tale, which is obviously a much better film, and it's clear that it was a very strong influence on this film, i.e. it's the film that this film is ripping off. That, along with Dragonheart, a much better film, which was made 15 years earlier and still has much better CGI dragons, but also Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, which came even before that and has a much better story that this film shamelessly pilfers. But yeah, it's a shame that this film couldn't even have managed to be as good as Age of Dragons, you know, the one that was Moby Dick with dragons in it, remember that? Well, that was bad, but it was fun bad. This is just bad. And it doesn't even seem to know if it's a comedy, because it isn't funny, but occasionally there's like weird pratfalls and stuff that you make it wonder if it's supposed to be like this kind of Jabberwocky-esque Monty Python style humour with pratfalls and stuff, but then with more drama and jokes later on, but at no point does any of it actually fit together cohesively. So yeah, 1 out of 5, consign this movie to the bin from whence it so clearly came. Another film I saw was Guns Akimbo, and I tell you, Harry Potter, or Daniel Radcliffe, certainly has had a weird career after he finished up killing off Lord Voldemort and being the boy that lived. He's gone on to be in horror films like The Woman in Black, and horror comedies like Horns or Victor Frankenstein, but he's also done serious stuff like, you know, that play Equus he's in. But plainly, I imagine that's because once you've spent your youth playing a typecasted role for years and years and it filled your bank account to absolutely brimming, you know, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So why wouldn't you do the exact opposite? And I suppose that's why Robert Pattinson has done exactly the same thing with his career, throwing himself in all these weird sort of roles after the Twilight movies, you know, stuff to prove that he's a real actor and not just like a pretty boy or like some kind of sex symbol for teenage girls and middle-aged women who like vampire stories. But anyway, Guns Akimbo, that sees him as a kind of needy, nerdy game programmer who ends up trolling a dark web reality TV murder game show, slagging off the regulars in the comments. But that ends up pissing off the crazies that run it, and he ends up finding himself in the game show with a pair of guns literally bolted to his hands, and having to go off and do a big deathmatch hunt with Nyx, who's the series championship. And it's really mediocre. Yeah, I mean, the trouble with Guns Akimbo, and that's the term used in films and games for somebody having two of the same gun, one in each hand, is that we've literally seen this all before. I mean, this is basically just Hardcore Henry, you know, that first-person hyperkinetic concept movie, or the Crank films with Jason Statham. So this is very much a poor man's attempt to copy that vibe, only it's not that clever, it's not that funny, it's not as interestingly shot, and the pacing is kind of slow, weird, and scenes kind of drag on, and considering it's supposed to be in this death duel with Nyx, who's a kind of cocaine-fueled psycho woman, every time they meet up, she kind of just stands around chatting, and he has ample time to actually shoot her, and I'm not entirely sure how she ever became champion, because she's so just lackadaisical about it all. And really, the issue seems to be that this is a 2 out of 5 movie that's the brainchild of Jason Lee Howden, who's a visual effects artist at Weta Digital, working on everything from Lord of the Rings to The Avengers to The Great Gatsby, and clearly this is his calling in all favours attempt to make a breakthrough film. And it shows, because although the stunts and the special and visual effects are fairly solid, the plot and the dialogue, as well as the scene-to-scene direction, are really, really lacking. Now, yeah, this is probably like a Friday night beer and pizza film, but it's not even a really good one, and it's not crap enough to be just, you know, a jolly good fun load of nonsense. So yeah, stick to something like the Crank films, you'll definitely have a better time than with this. There was, however, a return to a more serious kind of film in August, with the Mauritanian. Anyway, the one about the guy from Mauritius, which is in Africa. Anyway, this is the true story of a guy called Mohamedou Ould Slahi, and he got arrested in the weeks after 9/11 on account of him once having received a phone call from his terrorist cousin, who was using Osama bin Laden's personal phone at the time. Anyway, he ends up getting locked in Guantanamo Bay, and interrogated, tortured, and finally, after a change in the law in America, he gets sent lawyers, because he's never actually been charged with anything, and they can't really hold him without making a charge and putting him on trial. So in comes Jodie Foster and the girl off Divergent, who are both looking into his case and prepping for a trial, while Bumblebee Kumquats is the prosecution army lawyer against them. And you know what? Robert Downey Jr. and Bob Duvall are absolutely nowhere to be seen. Why would I bring those guys up? You know, I just can't remember. Anyway, now this film shares an awful lot of DNA with The Torture Report. That's the Adam Driver film I watched last year, where there was an awful lot of times where you just want the folk off this film to bump into the folk off that film, and so they can all just share details and everyone will know what's going on. But The fact is, as much of this film is about how Mahamadou is stuck there and can't even write about what's happening to him because he's afraid he'll be tortured even more as a result, while the Pentagon and CIA block and redact details of the few documents that Jodie Foster's character can actually get hold of. And this is a total slow burn of a movie, but it is a solid 4 out of 5 film. It's a bit rough to watch at times, and the reenactments of the torture, they aren't gratuitous, but they are kind of uncomfortable, and still, this is a story that's well worth seeing, if only as yet another indictment of how the Secret Services completely screwed up the war on terror. A completely different set of terror is the kind that I felt while watching Shadow in the Cloud. This is a low-budget Kiwi action horror movie that has quite an interesting inception and a bit of history to it. Now, it's a film based on a script by Max Landis, the literal terrible child of John Landis, who also wrote the pretty naff Will Smith film Bright.
Fairy lives don't matter today.
And Victor Frankenstein, which I mentioned earlier. But the idea behind the script was actually from Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Conan the Barbarian, Dark Star and Alien, and he originally envisioned his horror space classic Alien to be a film about a gremlin attacking a B-17 bomber during World War II. But very early into the idea, he actually changed it into being on a spaceship, and the rest is history. So Landis wrote a script based on that idea, only he ended up getting kind of cancelled, and the script got reworked and directed by Kiwi director Rosanna Lang. So the film's about Chloe Moretz, the girl who played Hit Girl in Kick-Ass, which is why you maybe recognise her. And she's an RAF pilot, sort of. It's complicated. But she's on a top-secret mission to transport a package from Auckland to Samoa during just a freight run, and at very, very short notice on this B-17 full of grumpy dudes who really don't want her there. So once she convinces them to let her stay on the plane, they stick her in the ball turret on the bottom of the plane, and then proceed to make lots of insulting and lewd comments about her while she gives them a bit of back chat over the radio, until she finally notices...
There's someone on the wing. Something.
Yes, it's a gremlin, literally, like in Gremlins, or that very famous Twilight Zone episode with William Shatner. Now, it's a kind of an interesting concept, mainly because half of the movie is actually just Moretz in this ball turret. It's just all on her, with the voices of the other crew coming over the radio. And that's something that could be done to really good effect. I mean, I've seen that idea done really well in that Tom Hardy film Locke, or in that Ryan Reynolds film Buried. So you can set a movie or a story entirely in a small space with one actor. I mean, basically you're turning it into a stage play at that point. And that would have been really good, only the dialogue is really, really awful. It also doesn't help, though, that halfway through the film, it suddenly turns into a straight-up daft action movie, because clearly they just found a bag of money sat lying somewhere and decided that, yeah, we'll just throw this into CGI and action budget, so let's make this all cheesy and daft and completely disregard physics or common sense or anything that makes sense. Now, I mean, I get it. What happened here was a simple idea, and at some point somebody thought, well, this story's kind of like Alien, and it's got a connection there, but when people think of Alien, they think of Ripley from Alien. But then, when people think of Ripley from Alien, they actually usually think of Ripley from Aliens, so we need to turn this girl into a badass action hero at the end of the movie.
Get away from her, you bitch!
And they do, and it comes out of nowhere, it's completely ridiculous, it's totally unearned, and it doesn't make any sense because she's also doing a whole load of things with her arms, which is crazy because she's already broken a finger and one of her arms during the film, and yet at the end of the movie she doesn't care. And yeah, the whole film just turns out a complete waste of common sense and brain space. So 2 stars, because it does look nice a couple of times, and because there was a germ of a decent idea here somewhere, and a few half-decent moments. But yeah, on the whole, this is a pile of cack. If you wanted to be judgmental, though, yeah, I just wouldn't bother. Judgmental. Why does the name The Judge keep popping into my head? Luckily, a film that did actually live up to the hype and was good fun was Boss Level. Now, this is a tongue-in-cheek wee film that's a time loop movie. I mean, you've seen time loop movies before, stuff like Groundhog Day, where Bill Murray has to relive the same day over and over again until he gets it right. But there's actually quite a lot of these films out there. I mean, some of them are pretty serious in tone. There's some of them that are more kind of like comedies, and then there's some that are more action-based, and some that are just downright bizarre. Boss Level, though, as the name implies, is kind of riffing on a computer game style, much like the Crank movies that I mentioned earlier, and the story all centres around a guy called Roy, who's an ex-military dude who wakes up continually on the same morning with the same assassins trying to kill him, and by now he's so used to being stuck in this time loop he literally just makes his morning coffee around the murder. But no matter what he does, he always ends up dying around midday and it resets back to the beginning. But he quickly figures out that it all has something to do with his ex-wife and her new employer, played by Mel Gibson. Now, this film is just straight up nonsense fun. I mean, Frank Grillo is excellent in this, which isn't surprising because he's usually pretty great, and Joe Carnahan, the director, proves that he's once again very, very versatile and intelligent, something that was apparent all the way back when he made the brilliant film Narc, which is honestly just an absolutely fantastic thriller, as well as his later movie The Grey, which is, again, hugely underrated film about basically depression, loneliness, and survival. So yeah, this is 4 out of 5 for boss level. It's everything that Guns Akimbo wanted to be. It's funny, it's exciting, it's fun, it's over the top, but it never manages to be irritating, stupid, or clumsy. And what's more, if you've got Amazon Prime, it's free. So I mean, really, what's not to like about this movie? If you haven't seen it already, check it out. And the last of the Sunday just after Friday movie nights in August was a film called Monsters of Man. Now, I've talked a lot about cheap first-time indie movies over my time, like ones where the creators had some pals out in the woods and they shot a film on a camcorder. Sometimes they had a budget, sometimes they didn't. But in this case, Monsters of Man, which is totally a mix of the jungle warfare films like Predator and Rambo, crossed with the fear of killer robots in films like Terminator, or more specifically, Short Circuit, which this film is very close to in a lot of ways. And it's all about these corrupt arms manufacturer and Pentagon guys who are collaborating to secretly test robot soldiers in a remote part of Cambodia, where they find a big drug dealing facility and a load of lost doctors happen to wander into the situation to try and help some sick kids somewhere, and they get caught in the crosshairs. But of course, when the robots attack, they go completely scorched earth when they realise that the mission's going to get compromised. But they didn't count on Discount Gerald Butler, like an ex-Navy SEAL guy who just happens to be hanging out there because I don't know. It doesn't really make sense, but he's maybe jaded and cynical or something, or maybe he's trying to find himself in the woods, who knows. But anyway, he helps everybody escape, or at least some of them, most of them die. But anyway, there's a subplot about the contracted programmers who didn't actually know what the job was apparently, and that's also kind of bizarre. And look, this is a dumb film. I mean, it's really silly, it's really basic, but you know what? It's competent, and it's vaguely entertaining, and just because it's decently shot and made, and because you're not actually rooting for anyone to survive, it's a lot of fun watching who gets blown up, who gets squished, who gets shot and stabbed. It's a 3 out of 5. It's a perfect bit of nonsense fun for a Friday night, or indeed, even a Sunday. So the first offering in September was a film called Enhanced on Prime. Now, this is a classic example of your middle-of-the-road B-movie, the sort of thing that back in the 80s you'd find coming out on VHS, or showing up at midnight in the middle of a random weekday, but basically, it's a very no-frills X-Men style of movie about some enhanced people who've just escaped from a government lab where they were being tested on or possibly created or something. And there's this secret crew of assault guys who are sent out to bring them back, only it could be the government isn't entirely the good guys here, and there might also be something else going on, and it's not entirely sure who's good and who's bad, and meanwhile this plucky mechanic lassie is trying to be a good enhanced, and to be honest, this was really boring. I mean, this was the cinematic equivalent of beige sludge. Now, I can't even say it was terrible, because it wasn't terrible, but it was really unimaginative. It was kind of flatly, boringly shot, with nobody actors who had virtually no charisma, and a script that could have been used to knock out insomnia sufferers. So 2 out of 5. This was naff and dull, generic, and it was a film so forgettable that if I could be bothered, I'd make a joke about the judge here, but I think even that joke is getting more tired and boring than this film, but not even quite. So it would be crediting that with a lot more entertainment value than it's worth. As we've seen before, delving into legal dramas can be interesting, or it can be a quite forgettable thing. You could forget what something was about. Which is why The Lincoln Lawyer was actually a really nice, clever and memorable film. See, this one was all about Matthew McConaughey, you know, alright, and he plays like a slimy defense lawyer, Mick, who can manipulate pretty much any given situation. And he lands this really great case where he's defending a super rich kid charged with assaulting a prostitute. And Mick reckons he's got this in the bag until, while the investigation goes on, he finds things are much more complicated than he expected, and there's a lot more at stake personally for him than he'd actually like. And that leads to a bit of gumshoe detectiving, some smart arse con artistry that makes some really good entertaining wee movie, and it's kind of a lot like what you would get if you crossed Better Call Saul with that movie I Care a Lot, only if it was good. And then you threw in a whole load of alright. So yeah, 4 out of 5, and not only that, there is apparently a TV show of this in the works. So yeah, when that comes out in the pipeline, I'll definitely want to check it out. And next up after that was The Green Knight. The Green Knight is a story of responsibility. Okay, enough of that. Okay, that's creepy. Right, The Green Knight is a story based on a medieval poem about King Arthur's knights, and about how one of them takes up a Christmas Day challenge to land a blow on this huge green knight that comes visiting, like King Arthur's Camelot. The promise is that whatever hit they manage to land on him, he gets to have back at the same person next Christmas. And young Gawain, who thinks himself a bit of a smartass, jumps up and cuts the guy's head off, thinking, haha, well, you can't cut my head off if you're dead. So yeah, he doesn't realise that unfortunately the Green Knight is actually some kind of magical elemental sprite or something like that, and he really might not have thought this through, and he might have to get his head cut off next Christmas. And It's kind of a bonkers movie. I mean, it's beautifully shot and it's told in this very episodic fashion where we get to see Gawain struggle his way north to the Green Chapel through all kinds of weird travails, hoping to keep his honour and not being very good at it, and trying to live up to the idea of chivalric knighthood, which is kind of what the poem's about, but they've recontextualised it into a bit more of a modern sensibility. Now, what you get out of this might vary, because this is definitely a Marmite movie, being kind of art house and making no apologies for the weird schisms between when it tries to stick to the poem stuff and then when it plays and just makes up its own stuff or goes off its own directions, or has people talking very modern voice, or sometimes it's a bit more ye olde, and yeah, sometimes the sound's all weird and sometimes people's voices are ambiguously distorted. At one point they even just cast Alicia Vikander as two completely different characters and nobody in the movie seems to remark on it. But yeah, for me, this is 100% my jam. And I think it was another stonking film from the A24 catalogue, the same great studio that produced like the weird and creepy ye olde tale The Witch, which is an amazingly scary film, but also done in a very ye olde fashion. They also did the cosmic horror psychological drama The Lighthouse, which I've talked about before, and also the zany 1980s tension fest Uncut Gems, or even the hallucinatory depression quest that was Midsummer. So yeah, check out their movies, because their movies are always good, but for me, The Green Knight especially, 5 out of 5. I've seen it twice now, and I think it might just become a Christmas classic in my house. So there you go. Next up was a film called The Goldfinch, which is based on a book. Now, everybody likes a good literary adaptation, and Lord knows there's an awful lot of them. From the sublimely good ones like Lord of the Rings movies or Catch-22, and the bizarre and strange ones like Age of Dragons. But The Goldfinch is the kind of adaptation where the people making it apparently didn't really understand why the book works, because what they made was really just a really long, kind of boring story. It's all about the guy from Baby Driver, who's a furniture salesman, but he grew up in a bad lot when his mum died in a terrorist attack and he ended up stealing a painting, the titular Goldfinch, while he was concussed. But then he has a bunch of other adventures that make sense if you read the book, I imagine, but in the film, since we're missing whatever the subtext is supposed to be, it ends up just being a lot of him doing not an awful lot and things being depressing, and then the story jumping back and forward in time to show things being more depressing. So yeah, can't really recommend. I mean, despite, some really good actors in it, and it actually being shot quite well, 2 out of 5, and really, that kid from Stranger Things with the unfortunate nose, yeah, he really can't do a Russian accent, so Niet is very bad, do not do it. Do not. And speaking of other completely unwatchable crap, this is a twofer. Because the Spanish film Summertime lives in infamy, since it was so unwatchably bad that it was summarily cancelled 15 minutes in when it became clear that there's absolutely nothing redeeming about this camcorder-looking shot piece of pretentious nonsense about two bikini-clad paranormal detectives looking into a haunted house, when in fact all they kind of really do is sort of bum about moaning about how the job's boring, snorting coke and talking about weird stuff. And not even like the 5-minute own brand Elvira intro style sequence could save it, but yeah. So, turned it off, never watched the rest. Absolute crap, 1 out of 5. This is garbage. So the film we ended up watching instead was Zombie Hunter, which is also kind of a badly shot, cheap film where a zombie apocalypse occurs and there's a kind of Tesco value Mad Max and he has to fight along with Chips and Beans Pamela Anderson and a weirdo brother and cute sister pair and a bunch of other randos, and they've got loads of zombies attacking them and some really bad CGI monsters and a very, very small amount of help from Danny Trejo, who's in the film for like 2 minutes as this sort of zombie killing priest guy. Yeah, he was all over the poster in the billing but barely in the movie. And look, this is not a good film. I mean, it's slightly better than Summertime, so I'd give it 2 out of 5, but barely watchable, hardly even fun to laugh at. So yeah, 2 for 2, both were complete poo. But here's one for the books. I actually went back to the movie Summertime again. Yep, you see, my internet was having a total mare one evening, and I'd still had it downloaded off of Prime onto my iPad from when I tried to watch it the previous time. And it turns out that almost immediately after the point where I turned it off, things started getting really weird. You see, the two bikini detectives start getting annoyed with themselves at how daft the situation is in the house, and more they start to break character until it becomes clear they're actors who know that they're actors who've been sent to a house to shoot a found footage horror movie, but they're actually now trapped inside the movie, and they keep getting confounded and troubled by cuts and things, and they start trying to find the script and change it, and okay, the story drags out far too long, and they get into all kinds of meta stuff, and then a random dude turns up, and there's a musical number at one point, and it just gets more and more nuts as the film goes on. The trouble is it also gets kind of boring. There's really maybe about 40 minutes at most of material here, and the film's 90 minutes long and was clearly shot for about £5. So despite all that and me coming back to watch it, it's still only a 2 out of 5 film. But it gets at least that extra 1 point because it's not quite the 1 out of 5 garbage that I originally thought. So there you go. Sometimes it's worth watching something to the end, and sometimes you're right just to turn it off in the first place. So clearly, because October was such a fantastic month and clearly my life was getting far too easy, simple and enjoyable, I decided to watch Parallel, the story of a bunch of smart, trendy young app developers who get pipped to the punch when their programmer undercuts them to their financiers. So, in a drunken bout of self-satisfied commiserating, they wind up finding a magical door to their house's shared attic, where there's a kind of crazy mirror that lets you step into alternate realities. But as soon as they know they can skip into alternate realities, they start heading over and emptying their own bank accounts from themselves in other universes and stealing art and ideas that doesn't exist in their own universe. Only, inevitably this brings out the worst in absolutely everybody and it all starts going horribly wrong. Now, there actually are some really good ideas in this film and some decent work from, well, that guy who was the bad guy, Mr. Robot, who's to be honest the only recognisable face here. And the plot feels like somebody took the idea of the old Danny Boyle film Shallow Grave. You know, the one where they get the big bag of drug money and then they end up all using it for bad purposes. And anyway, also the film Flatliners, that 80s movie recently remade with Elliot Page, all about medical students killing and resuscitating themselves to see what happens after death. Well, this isn't actually anywhere near as good as either of those movies, so yeah, I would say this is a 2 out of 5 at best, with the characters far too thinly sketched, the plot messy, and despite a kind of fun finale, it's a bit of a slog to get through to the end, so yeah, not much to recommend this. Maybe in an alternate universe this was fantastic, but not in this one. Another less than stellar Sunday night movie was Aftermath. Now on paper this sounds like a great setup. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's like a semi-retired architect, builder, handyman, built like a tank but with a kind heart, and he's all about his wife and soon-to-be mum-daughter. Then tragedy strikes when a weird strange events conspire in air traffic control and Scoot McNairy ends up sort of semi-responsible for a plane crashing and everyone getting dead because of the ground. So what can Arnie do but investigate, seeking out truth, and maybe even team up with depressed and suicidal Scoot to get to the bottom of this, kicking names and taking ass? Only it's not really that kind of movie at all. This is a kind of a bit of a slow burn, sad, true story about how these guys both deal with a related trauma. Only it's not actually all that good or interesting, and let's face it, Arnold Schwarzenegger's never actually been a great actor, and even less so these days in his post-Governator existence. And while Scoot McNairy genuinely is a good actor, seen in films like Monster, which genuinely he's brilliant, in this film he doesn't have a huge amount to work with. So when it all finally winds up, you're left wondering why you still feel like you barely know these characters and feel like you must have missed whatever the essential point of this film really was. So yeah, another 2 out of 5. It really did have potential, but most of it got squandered. Still, nothing I'd seen so far this month was as bad as Chaos Walking. This is an adaptation of a young adult novel, or YA novel, The Knife of Something or Other, and is all set on this colony planet in the future where everything's basically your pretty normal crap western farmer future a la Firefly, but on a world where men's thoughts appear as a kind of audio-visual noise emanating from their heads, but only men's thoughts, which is kind of lucky as there's no women, apparently, because aliens killed them all, apparently. Anyway, Spider-Man lives there, and then one day Rey Skywalker walks up and she's like, "What's all this?" And then Hannibal the mayor's like, "She's bad, let's steal her spaceship." And then a lot of fucking nonsense ensues, and it's not fun, it's not big, it's not clever. Honestly, with the people involved in making this, I've no idea how it turned out quite this bad, but it did. I mean, this is the same director who made The Bourne Identity back in the day, and made Edge of Tomorrow. I mean, seriously, Edge of Tomorrow. One of the best action films made in years, one of the best sci-fi films in years. But then I do suppose he has had his share of mediocrity over the years as well. But this is basically just garbage. I mean, they never made a sequel, thank God, even though they're like 4 books or something, and this bombed without trace. So, 1 out of 5, let's hope it stays bombed and gone, and let this film's noise no longer be heard. Slightly better, though not by a huge amount, was Dave Made a Maze. And this is all about Dave, who's an unemployed guy whose much more successful girlfriend comes home one day to find he's built a cardboard maze. Indeed, a labyrinth. And he's stuck inside. Only he won't come out, or he can't come out, and then he insists on them not actually damaging the maze, and then she invites pals round, and during the sort of weird Dave pity party they eventually try and crawl inside, only to find it's not just a little model he's made. Somehow once you're inside it, it's an actual giant maze with traps and monsters and a minotaur running around. And of course, you don't have to be a genius to work out that this is all really just a big metaphor for Dave's own feelings of failure and being trapped in an incredibly on-the-nose way. Now, this is one of those kind of bonkers indie idea movies where somebody thought, "I've got a wacky idea," and they just ran with it. And then they just kept adding scenes and scenes until the script was at least 90 pages long and they felt they could make a movie. Unfortunately, it all ends up being kind of ropey and unsatisfying.
But, I mean, credit where credit's due. It's a fun concept, and they really clearly had some fun and clever stuff with the maze sets and props, and the fact that everything's made out of cardboard, there's a lot of ingenuity, and there's an awful lot of film references actually in here. The trouble is, the actual minute-to-minute dialogue isn't very good, there's too many characters, and every scene and every sequence in the film usually goes on about 2 minutes too long. And 2's a good number because I give this 2 out of 5. It's just not interesting or funny enough to maintain what could have been a fun episode of a 30-minute zany TV show like Mythic Quest or something. But yeah, as a 90-minute movie, it's too long and too dragged out, so this is another one I'm afraid I can't really recommend. Oh, and just before we're done, yes, this was a leftover from last year, The Judge, which we all completely forgot. I forgot to include it because I forgot I'd even seen it. Yeah, daft legal drama, has Iron Man and Kingpin, and it's a court case and something about a bicycle, and to be honest, yeah, there was nothing wrong with it, but there was nothing really right about it either. A boring film, not like any of us will ever watch it again, but 3 out of 5 because it was competently made, but not competent enough that you're going to remember anything about it, and not bad enough that you're going to sit and laugh about it or complain about it to anyone. An utterly forgettable movie. And to cap everything off, how could we have done better than ending the year with a slew of classic movies? And slew is probably an apt phrase considering the first up was Murray's choice of George Romero's seminal Dawn of the Dead, to perfectly set us up on the road to Christmas with a tale of mindless consumerism and the fall of humanity being brought about by a deadly passable virus. Ho ho ho. Following that was another Christmas movie with Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which is actually a reference to James Bond, random trivia. That had Iron Man and Mad Martigan as a pair of sleuthing detectives in festive Hollywood getting into all sorts of hijinks back in the day, you know, when Shane Black actually wrote good films.
Shut the fuck up!
The Predator! Worst film ever.
You shut the fuck up.
Oh, how the mighty hath fallen. But lest we get in too much cheer, it was up to Si to bring us crashing back down to earth with the fiscal tragedy of margin call and the dour and depressing Glengarry Glen Ross-like infighting and dodgy dealing of Wall Street salarymen on the brink of the financial crash. Yay! And from that disappearing money to disappearing people with The Prestige, my selection, and in my opinion still Christopher Nolan's best and most satisfying movie, turning a period movie of dueling magicians into a giant 2-hour magic trick full of twists and an awful lot of serious stern acting. But we ended on a fun, happy note with the family-friendly classic The Goonies, because, you know, what is Friday move to Sunday film night all about if not the power of friendship, working together, and pirates? Yep, the classic film with Sam Gamgee, Thanos, and Boris Johnson was a perfect antidote to the rest of 2021, ending things on a high note of a year of films well spent. So that was 2021, almost a complete year of weekly films, 49 to be exact, of every single type, description, genre, and level of quality. Gentlemen, it has been my pleasure to edit this daft wee video together and rate these films as best I could in the way I felt was appropriate. And onwards hence, wherever the road may take us, here's to 2022 and a lot more films.
What a heavy load Einstein must have had. Fucking morons everywhere.